And thanks to all of you for spending your time with us this afternoon. We have a tough act to follow. If you sat through the first panel, I'm sure you would think that. Fortunately, we have a great panel who will, I'm sure, prove up to that task. And we have a lot of both public sector experience on our panel and private sector experience, and I think we'll have a great discussion. Without spending too much time in introductions, on my immediate left is Rob Alderfer, who is the Vice President of Technology Policy at CableLabs, and has, I'm sure, a lot to say that will be of interest to us. Next to Rob is Larry Downs, who's the Project Director of the Georgetown Center for Business and Public Policy. Next to him is David Goldman, who's the Director of Satellite Policy for SpaceX. And on the far left-hand side is Charla Rath with Verizon. Charla, I'm sorry, I don't have the exact title because I got it. Vice President of Wireless Policy Development at Verizon. So thank you. So having listened to that first panel, let me just start our panel off with the first question, which is, we heard a lot about different ways of defining success and failure. I'd be interested to hear how you would define that, and in particular, referring to the list that was distributed earlier, which one you would think qualified the most as a success. So I'm going to put you on the spot, Rob.
Okay, sure. So I guess I get the privilege of kicking us off. Thank you, Bob, and thanks, Pierre and Silicon Flatirons for having us. So my view on what success is, I think, is colored by my formative years working for the White House Office of Management and Budget, where we would think of policy really of any type as being successful if it met its intended purpose and did so in a way that was better than the alternatives. So in Spectrum, we tend to think about that as success being maximizing economic output. We heard about that from the last panel, Tom Hazlett. And I think it's possible to one of Brian's questions earlier that a different objective could be defined, right? If you're talking about government use, you might be talking about saving lives as the objective, or monitoring weather and climate, that sort of thing. And I think still, even if you have that different objective, in that case, the criteria for success is still the same. Does the policy meet its purpose in a least costly way that maximizes benefits? So focusing in on the commercial spectrum world and getting to your question of what is sort of a leading example of success, I'm going to echo a lot of what Commissioner Rosenworcel said actually earlier to kick us off today, and say at the top of my list is Wi-Fi and the innovation that's been enabled through the policy of unlicensed spectrum. And when we look at Wi-Fi as embodying that success, really what we see is just a ton of innovation, billions of devices out there. The commissioner said 9. I thought it was closer to 10, but what's a billion here or there when you're talking about Wi-Fi? And we see increasing diversity and capability of those devices. We're really now at the cusp of gigabit service over Wi-Fi and still increasing. And it's pretty intuitive if you think about that success. Just imagine a day in the life without Wi-Fi. Tough to do, right? So there's some data around that intuition that I wanted to share with everyone today. iPass, which is a Wi-Fi networking company, did a fun little survey around what people think is the most indispensable thing for them to have on a day-to-day basis. And here's where that list of things came out in order of priority from lowest to highest. Alcohol, chocolate, sex, Wi-Fi. Might have been up here. I'm not sure exactly where it was, but suffice it to say that I think that puts it in perspective. So when you think about Wi-Fi as a success of that magnitude, you have to ask, how did we get here? In unlicensed spectrum policy, I think the defining features of success, what enabled that success, is two things, one of which we heard about earlier already, and I think we'll touch on more here. That's flexible use regulation. And another is industry collaboration. So just to define that a little bit more, by flexible use regulation, we're talking about, of course, basic rules of the road that don't require individuals or organizations or companies to ask permission for what to do or not do on that service. So flexibility in how to use that spectrum and evolve that over time. By industry collaboration, and this is a point that I think hasn't been mentioned yet, what I'm talking about is industries working together to take advantage of that flexibility, to develop new technologies in a way that's iterative, generally through standards, and improve them over time. And those two ingredients, I think, are the lessons I take from the success of unlicensed spectrum and Wi-Fi. And so that's my one success.
All right. Rob, thanks. Larry, we'll move on to you, and I'm not going to ask you how you would rank those four.
Yes, right. I'm not sure I know. So thanks very much. So I was listening to the last panel, and I was thinking about this over the course of the week. And one of the things that keeps coming up, there's a phrase that shows up all the time in discussions about spectrum allocation, and that is best and highest, or sometimes highest and best use. Now, I was not able to run this completely to the ground, and maybe it's a good student project, but I don't know where that phrase originated. It's not in any of the statutes. It shows up all the time in FCC documents and filings, but it's never sourced. It's never cited. I asked Blair Levin. He didn't know, so that told me it was obscure enough. And I also searched through Tom Hazlett's book, and it doesn't appear once in his book, so he doesn't use that phrase. But that seems to me the point that people always use when they talk about spectrum and its importance. And I think it's the right starting point, because we reached a point some years ago, around the time of the National Broadband Plan, where we really had the sort of what we refer to as the spectrum frontier closed. That is to say, we've reached the point now where it was really all about reallocation of spectrum. Now, with 5G and so on, we've now pushed the spectrum out, the frontier out further, and so, but even there's settlers everywhere, even in the millimeter wave frequencies. But by and large, we're talking about trade-offs between uses. And the way to measure success, well, again, is one use better or higher, or better and higher than another use. And I don't know how to measure. I mean, obviously, subjectively, I get much more out of my LTE telephone than I do out of over-the-air analog broadcast television. So clearly, to me, that was taking broadcast analog television and moving it to LTE. That's a better and higher use. But that's subjective. And so I think, echoing what some of the other panelists said on the previous panels, the only real way to measure success here is economic output, or what Coase said, maximum welfare. And that may be in the form of more jobs or more consumer surplus or other kind of economic measures, all of which, of course, are themselves somewhat subjective, not quite as subjective as I was saying. And we really don't have a lot of good data on that. I think what's been encouraging, certainly in the last year, has been the formation at the FCC of the Office of Economics and Analytics, sort of bringing all the economists together. Hopefully that will lead to more of these kinds of measurements. Again, they're never going to be perfect, and in hindsight, they're always going to look right or wrong. But I think that's really the best way to measure success. And my best example of success would have to be Coase's proposal for auctioning instead of sort of the more politically oriented sort of command and control allocation of spectrum, which had happened up until that point. But we have to say, and I think we'll get to this, because every one of the successes that we'll talk about is tinged with a certain amount of failure. And of course, in the case of that example, Coase's essay proposing this was published in 1959. That was the year I was born. Obviously, it was many, many, many years before it actually took place. And in the interim, lots of potential opportunities, lots of potential job creation and innovation, and lots of that was lost or certainly suboptimal. So that's my caveat on the success.
All right, thank you. And you've touched on a couple of very interesting subjects. One being something that may be a success today may not always be a success, and that's something I think I'd like to come back to in a little bit. But let me go over to David to get his thoughts.
So I was really hoping that the first panel was going to be really bad, and I have all prepared of they said all this wrong, but and I was going to be really clever, and then they said all the stuff that I had. So I'm done. No, I actually, the thing that Julie said first, so first of all, I should say about 3/4 of what I know about spectrum I learned from listening to Julie, so like not surprisingly, I think that I agree with a lot of what Julie said. The first thing he said when he was measuring success was opportunities. I think that's absolutely right. When you're talking about success of what? Is it success of how we're measuring the spectrum, or is it successful policy? And I think a successful policy doesn't necessarily translate immediately into the most pops per megahertz or something. I think that'd be the wrong way to look at it, is when you're on the policy side of it, are you setting up a policy that gives the most people the most opportunity to try something and try to develop it? Are you creating incentives to iterate? Rob was talking about this. Are you creating incentives for people to iterate and come up with new ideas? I think that it's a couple people have mentioned it now, but I think it bears repeating is good successes get stale over time. I think there's a tendency in spectrum, because it is so hard to allocate and distribute, that it becomes this barrier to entry, and it becomes a barrier to change. And so things that were great 10 years ago may be stale and old now. And so policies that encourage that to move on, encourage people to iterate, the people who are on the spectrum to come up with new ideas and not just sit on, thank God we're not still on 2G, right? And I know Verizon has some of their licenses they use for 2G, they're now using for 4G, 5G. And thank God that's going on. I mean, so we need to make sure we have the incentives to do that, because we've also can point to examples of where people have been sitting on it for too long, that it was a great idea at first, and at some point it was old and not the best way to be serving it. So going to examples, I mean, honestly, Wi-Fi is such a great one. That is the place. If you think about how do you set up a good policy, is you set up the high-level milestones that you're trying to reach. What are you trying to accomplish? And then you put in the protections, the interference protections, and whatever you need to put in there. And then you let industry and you let the innovators go and innovate and try to meet those objectives. And Wi-Fi is such a great example of that. That is exactly what happened. Possibly stealing from Charla a little bit, but like flexible licenses. It's something in the United States that we take for granted and we don't really talk about that much. But when you go overseas, a lot of the failures that you see overseas are because they prescribe and say, this is your license for 10 years and you're doing this technology with it. And flexible licenses is what helped the United States get ahead. So when I was going through the list, though, and I work for a company that we're doing satellites now, and I only saw one satellite thing, so I'm going to say that was the biggest one. So I got the hint, and on top of that, we're a rocket company, so we launch these satellites. So like the policy that led to more satellites, that is awesome.
Whatever that is.
Yeah, so it's the Open Skies satellite policy. It actually is an interesting story, right? Because it's initially, when we started in space travel, people thought that launching satellites was going to be too risky, too expensive for any company to be able to pull that off. And so governments came in, and they were trying to launch their own satellites, and it was going to be government controlled, and anything that we were going to do with satellites was going to be the government was going to do it. They were going to own the satellites. And through the Open Skies policy, they moved on. And at first, the first step was, actually, we will let other people own the satellites, but we'll prescribe what they're for. And we saw an effort to do things like prescribe voice services over satellite, but by the time that it was built and launched, that was already overtaken by events. And the more flexible we've moved with satellites, the more that we've actually seen much more innovation. And we're starting to approach, arguably starting to be the cusp of the golden age of space and satellite communication, because it's gotten more flexible and because it's gotten easier, and we've gotten where, once again, the government sets the milestones. It says what we're trying to accomplish at a high level. It gives the interference protections and things that we need to do. We got to make sure we watch out for orbital debris. But then lets the industry go and figure out how to get that done in the best possible way. And I think that's where we've seen the biggest successes.
Thanks, David, and Charlotte, thanks for waiting. And
happy to.
What do you got for us?
So first I want to say thanks to the students who actually put together this compendium. I know, Pierre did a lot of the work, but also I understand that several of you in the room probably wrote these. And actually, I was talking to Pierre before we started, and I thought there were some interesting references in there, things that I hadn't read before or seen. So it was kind of fun. So thank you for that. But I do have a question. In what world is wireless LNP part of a spectrum discussion? And we'll have to have this later. And I know that it's not, because I've done spectrum for the last 18 years for Verizon, and I was not involved in wireless LNP. And I know I would have been had it been a spectrum issue. So on that basis alone, I think we should chuck that one out as a, as a shame or fame. Do I have a... LNP, wireless local number portability, which is in your, it's one of the ones that's, thanks for the reminder though. So yes, flexibility, look, it's great. I actually was one of the people who recommended that Wi-Fi be on there because in part, and it's not so much Wi-Fi, it's unlicensed. And what the commission was thinking about doing 30-something years ago was we lived in a block allocation system where there was very little ability to actually determine your own fate as a licensee. So unlicensed was a fabulous, fabulous innovation because it really allowed people to come in and do that, and I think it still does that. But what's interesting to me is that the licensed world has moved much more toward the unlicensed world, and I see Steve up there, and we've had Steve Sharkey, and we've had conversations about this as they sort of are converging in terms of, how much flexibility a licensee has and how much more protection, for example, unlicensed users want to get. That's a conversation for another day, though. But what struck me, though, is that we've all talked about flexibility, but there really isn't a section on here that talks about flexibility. So I'm going to raise one that, for me, is the Hall of Fame. And without discussing this with Julie in advance, he actually brought it up, and that's digital cellular back in 1988. And it was right about then that I was actually starting in this. I was working for NTIA, and I was given a project to look at the UHF, ultra-high frequency, taboos, which ultimately led into a project where we did a major report on spectrum that included recommendations that the commission go after auction authority, but it also had flexible use in there. And one of the key things that we noted was the commission's decision in 1988 not to require that, at that point, cellular operators, the two in each market, not to require them to pick a specific standard that the commission would pick. And Julie and I have talked about this before, and he's going, we wouldn't even have picked GSMA, we would have picked TDMA. So, if any of you know the history of that, that would not have been a good decision. So what they did is they allowed, and again, this is me speaking from a number of years of experience now in the wireless and the terrestrial wireless industry. What that has allowed us to do is to buy spectrum that has ostensibly been lined up to be 2G spectrum, and we use it for 3G or 4G or whatever G, because the commission doesn't require us to come back to them and ask for permission to actually change out things. So that's technical flexibility. But there's also something that was going on during that same period called user flexibility, and where we saw that, and that sort of is where Fleet Call, then Nextel, then Sprint came out of that, because the waiver situation, and somebody here can tell me, I've heard both things, that there really wasn't, they weren't given a waiver because they were found to actually be in compliance. That some people think they were given a waiver, but that's almost 30 years ago. We'll worry about that later. But what they did by the commission saying, you know what, you can actually compile this and use it for some other purpose, they created a third competitor to cellular, and that, to me, those two decisions really started to move things in a very interesting way. And what's interesting to me is that, so those are Hall of Famers, but it's really hard to actually then say, well, this one's good and that one belongs here, because what the commission has done in this area is they've incrementally They've done more and more. For example, we were talking about it at the break. PCS came in, very flexible, came in the early 90s. And it was competitive to cellular, or it was, purchased by cellular. It were frequencies. And cellular, meanwhile, had all this legacy regulation on it that slowly but surely the commission, by virtue of a number of different decisions, got rid of. Aaron tells me it's not done yet. Looks pretty good to me, but so, and then they did things like allow you to sell your spectrum sooner than they used to allow you to do it. And they also did things like saying, you can disaggregate, you can partition your spectrum. These are all things that pretty much don't take place anywhere else in the world but here in the United States. I mean, in the rest of the world, you actually, if you want to sell a spectrum license, in some places you have to sell the whole company. You can't buy an individual license. So here, not only can I buy an individual license, I can buy a small, it drives the commission crazy, I know this, but I can buy a very small piece and just cordon it off by, latitude and longitude. All that came, from my view, from what the commission decided to do in digital cellular and some of the other decisions early
So
on.
let me test that a little bit. We've heard, it seems like everyone pretty much agrees that flexibility is really a touchstone of a successful policy. But I wonder if there are limits to that. And I'm interested in the digital cellular example. And Charla, you and Julie both made very good cases why that's a success. What I didn't hear Julie say, and I'm not going to put him on the spot because he's not on the panel, so I'm going to put you on the spot,
Okay.
the others, is whether the adoption of the AMP standard in the first place was a success.
Yeah, that's a hard one to answer. I think I know what you think, and I had never really thought about that before. It is a way that when you've got a nascent industry, but I don't think we'd have to do something like that anymore. Whether it was successful or not, what did we learn from it? I think we learned that it's probably better not to do that, even though AMPs may have been a good thing to do in the first place. I mean, it did lead to some, later years, lead to some interesting, for example, a cellular license was determined by the AMPS contour. So, again, it's sort of a difficult thing for the FCC to deal with in ULS, difficult for all of us. We had some really weird spots where we didn't have service because the PCS and the cellular didn't overlap. So I think I'd be interested in your view, because I know you have a view that it actually does belong in should be seen in a positive light.
I'm the moderator. I'm not sure. So okay, just quickly, my view is it was needed at the time, and it helped because you had so many. It wasn't just, of course, the wireline companies that were getting the licenses. It was a lot of non-wireline companies, and we're talking hundreds, potentially, all across the country in the small service areas. And you took out, I think, with the standard, a lot of potential issues and delay, and you got an interoperable system, and you were able to consolidate and provide national service. And,
It's a good
to the
point.
commission, great credit, when it was no longer needed, they got rid of it.
Actually.
But anyway, I'm sorry, the panelists, please.
So can I pick up on your question of limits to flexibility? Because I mentioned flexibility as an ingredient to success in the context of unlicensed, and I think that is true, along with industry collaboration was my other point. Charla mentioned unlicensed users looking for more protection, and I want to pick up on that because I think there's a common thread here. Let's think about what was the real enabler for success of unlicensed in terms of technology development. It was the IEEE, the Institute of Electrical Engineers, to define acronyms.
Yeah, all right.
So it's a professional society and standards body that developed the 802 standard, which is Wi-Fi. So that iterative process, we've gone through several generations. I don't even remember what generation we're on now. Richard probably knows. That's what really led to the success of Wi-Fi as the embodiment for unlicensed spectrum policy. Now, things are getting more complex, and that's where I think some limits on flexibility I wouldn't quite go there, but I would say at least regulatory oversight of the industry governance process around unlicensed spectrum. And I say that because, as Charla mentioned, mobile technologies are being developed for the unlicensed bands now. And it's becoming a more complex space. It's not just one industry body or one primary industry body that's developing standards for unlicensed. We now have two, IEEE and 3GPP. And they generally don't talk to each other regularly. So when you're trying to use the same spectrum with different technologies, there's the potential for some ill-intended effects. And just to make this a little more concrete, let's think about the 5 gigahertz band. This is the workhorse band for Wi-Fi. It's where a lot of the new mobile unlicensed technologies are being developed. We have 802.11ac and AX from the IEEE family, and also from the IEEE family is DSRC, Dedicated Short-Range Communications, which the commissioner mentioned earlier. From 3GPP, we have License-Assisted Access LTE, LAA LTE, ELAA LTE, two-way LAA. We have cellular V2X. I'm running out of fingers here, but we also have new radio 5G unlicensed. So when you have that diversity of technologies, that intensive use of the spectrum, there's bound to be different interests. And that's where I think the FCC can play a supervisory role to monitor how that technology is being developed, because I really think there's, it would be, I think, a terrible thing for the utility of the unlicensed band to fall victim to a sort of race to the bottom in terms of how aggressive can I be in this space.
Okay. Larry, let me follow up with you on something you said. You suggested that you potentially could look at something, some of these as both being successes and failures. Do you have an example of that? I mean, and is that a time-related issue, or are there other considerations?
So it's partially time. And actually, a big part of it is time. But yeah, so I'll go back to the one I was starting to suggest, which was the conversion from analog to digital TV, which a great success. Who misses analog TV? When you click on a YouTube now, if it's 240 resolution, you're like, what is that? I can't even look at that anymore. But clearly, and it freed up all the spectrum that we're now using for LTE. But clearly, it took too long. And why did it take too long? Well, there were competing understandings of technology. There were competing political things. But the key was that Congress kept changing the date because they were concerned that one person would be left behind. That somebody there, the analog TV would stop, the digital TV would start, and there was somebody who had not gotten the message, and they hadn't converted their set, or they hadn't updated, or they hadn't already switched to cable, which most of them had done anyway. And that delayed it at least a couple more years than was necessary. And then, of course, there were coupons for getting the converter box, but if your TV wasn't, cable ready, it certainly got to a point well before that where it would have been much more cost effective just to buy a cable subscription for everybody who wasn't already converted, who didn't have a TV that could already switch from analog to digital. Yeah. And obviously that's not politically feasible. But it's clear that if you set the standard as literally leave no one behind, no let's make a deal viewer left behind. That was sort of Congress's approach to it. You're going to not maximize welfare, and the real tragedy of that was, I think, and this may be more controversial, is because that happened so slowly. Part of the idea of that transition was that the broadcasters were trading in their analog spectrum. They were going to get the digital spectrum. And that digital spectrum, because it was more efficient, they could not only continue to broadcast what they were already broadcasting, but they could add additional channels in between. They could offer a retail wireless service. They could really do all kinds of things with that spectrum. But because it took so long, by the time it happened, the analog broadcast industry was really struggling. And I don't think there's really any good examples where they have, in fact, any local stations took that spectrum and were able to use not only for the transition, but to generate new business. And of course, a lot of them are still in very, very difficult business situation. So yeah, I think time is a big part of it, but also just kind of setting a standard that doesn't make any sense, that says, we can't, we can't let anybody miss a TV show. That really was a poor choice.
David,
We're talking. So we're the success panel, but all we're talking about is failure.
got off a little easy on that last question about success. So let me ask you a question. Obviously, you've been in both government and the private sector. Has your perspective changed about what's a good policy decision?
Coincidentally, all of the policies I thought were right before happened to work really well for my company. So no, not at all. No, it's funny that you say that. I was just talking to Rath before I came down. I used to say all the time, like I used to be on panels when I was working in the House, where people would ask me 5G panels, and people would start out all the time at asking me, "Is like, what is 5G?" And my answer always was, "I'm the last person you would want me to answer what is 5G." If I'm working in Congress, the time from when spectrum is usually identified to the time that it actually comes out and is being used in the market, I think the time's getting shorter. But I mean, it's 8 to 10 years is traditionally where it went. If I was if someone in Congress was defining that, that would be, by the time you got the spectrum out there, we would have been on 7G. I mean, it was like it wouldn't. That's not the right approach. And I think, so I don't, for me, no, I don't think that it's changed. I do think that it should be. I do think, getting back to a little bit to what Rob and Larry were talking about, I do think the Commission does take a good approach in a number of these places. Like Rob was talking about with Wi-Fi and LAA coming in. And one of the things that I think the FCC did well is speak softly but carry a big stick. There's a lot of the approach was kind of what I have 2 little kids. It's what I do with my kids. It's like, you guys go figure this out because you don't want me to figure this out for you. And I do think the FCC does a good job when it takes those approaches. I know one of the things that we deal with on the satellite front in the constellations that we're dealing with is how do we get along with each other? And one of the policies the FCC adopted there that seems like a smart approach was nobody wants to have to divide. Everyone wants that we share. That's the best outcome for everybody. Nobody wants it to be that we segment and divide up and everyone gets a tiny little sliver that's not really useful for anybody. And kind of the approach the FCC took was figure this out yourselves, or you don't want me to come up and fix this for you. Is they said, you guys go negotiate in good faith and you solve the problem, because if you don't, we're going to put in the thing that nobody wants. And that's a better approach. It's much better than the approaches of saying whoever got there first. And that, I mean, that applies in satellite. I think it applies in a lot of places. This is where you do get people who are using. Get to Larry's point of if you have one customer, then you're therefore protected forever. That is what takes away the incentive for someone to ever innovate what they're doing. Is if all you have to do is wave around that you have a couple of customers, that you're protected forever. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't protect the customers, you absolutely should, but the policy should be balanced in a way that also encourages people who are there to have to share, bring in new people, and to be constantly innovating.
So one question for anyone who cares to comment on it. Commissioner Rosenworcel this morning mentioned how the U.S. has been the world's leader in spectrum policy and has some very good examples. My question is, are there examples from other nations where we could learn in terms of what's been successful and how we can apply them to our decisions? Anyone want to take a shot at that, recognizing that the commissioner's still here?
Well, it would be great to be China, where you just tell people to move. And I'm not just referring to spectrum. Right? You want to put a road there? Put a road there.
Yeah.
In some ways these and I'm not an expert by any means on international spectrum policy, but I think they're difficult comparisons because obviously, you have countries that have very different form of government. You have countries that are effectively urban centers like South Korea and Japan. And so you can do things, I think, very differently. So that's all I'd say about it.
Well, New Zealand did a lot of the sort of flexible use auctioning. very open-ended licensing before the United States did back in the 90s. In fact, a lot of the work that was done, the academic work, was looking at what New Zealand did. But what was interesting is that we then, continue to take it, step by step further. The only thing, it's interesting, we're talking spectrum policy, not auction policy, but I do think that some countries have probably been a little bit more advanced in their approach to spectrum auctions than we have until we started doing the incentive auction and things like that. So it's been that's been sort of an interesting thing, but it touches obviously on spectrum, but it's sort of a different issue. That would be the only thing that I would think of. But I completely agree with the commissioner. It's astounding to me just. When I'm in some of these meetings, and I don't do very much international work, but I do get people ask me to come and speak to groups. And I had one gentleman from a country that I won't name, but it was the regulator, and I told him how things worked in this country, and he's going, well, don't tell our operators anything about that. So it's not common.
Yeah, so CableLabs has members all over the world. I do some work outside of the U.S. Supporting our European members, and I'd say the one thing that we've done right is not letting the states do spectrum policy here in the U.S. At the federal level, much preferable. The European model where you have every member state with their own national regulatory authority, then layer on top of that commission-level bureaucracy tied up with the Parliament and the Council. It's very difficult to get things done there. So. The institutional model we have here in terms of federalism, I think, works for spectrum.
Okay. So I'm interested. I think we heard a couple of things in the last panel, but I'm interested when you look at the spectrum policy and this decision. Do you have any empirical measures that you can use to decide? Well, this one worked, this one didn't work. And if you do, what are they? Or should you use empirical measures at all? Maybe that's a better question.
I think for me, it's a pretty boring answer, and it's been mentioned before, maximizing economic output. And you can wrap a lot of stuff into that, both sort of time to develop product, as well as competition, innovation. But I think that's the key metric to look at.
Yeah, I don't know what else. I don't know what anything else is subjective and not particularly helpful. But to Rob's point, it's hard to do. And as I say, that's why it's so encouraging that the FCC has created this new Office of Economics and Analytics. Hopefully, that will advance the science of how do we measure economic output from a particular policy decision, whether it's spectrum related or otherwise. But certainly, it's certainly preferable to the alternative of just make it up.
I do have a slight. I don't know if I don't think I disagree, but just another layer on it is some way of measuring spectral efficiency. And I know figuring out how you measure the economics can be squishy, and figuring out how you measure efficiency is equally squishy. But trying to go towards that route, again, if you start putting in policies where you're actually encouraging people to be efficient with their spectrum, it starts encouraging the people who are already there to iterate more. You're encouraging people come in who can find newer, higher, better uses for the spectrum. So some way of putting in incentives towards building towards more efficient spectral use, I think is helpful too.
Well, and actually, if you go back again to why auctions with exclusive flexible use were put in place, it was for exactly that reason, because then what it does is it gives the individual licensee the incentive to actually be very efficient, because if you're more efficient, you actually can have more customers on the same amount of spectrum. And it's pretty simple. That actually leads to usually better revenue opportunities. And you have control. You're able to sort of manage noise floor. There's a lot of things that you can do in that, and that is actually the basis for for going down in that path, is incentives to use spectrum not just technically efficiently but economically efficiently.
Which, by the way, brings up the big problem which we have, which is federal users who have no incentives. In fact, in some ways they can't have incentives to be more efficient, either technically or economically, and that's why we have the problem that we do of underutilized or unutilized federal spectrum, and even where the departments are willing or want to make a deal, in many cases they're prohibited from doing so.
And because the alternative is actually, I mean, if you think about what the alternative is, it's a race to get in there as fast as you can and take up as much room as you can. Because it's not necessarily serve as many customers as you can is the best way. It's take up as much room and keep competitors out. If you can control the market, you get all the customers even if you're not innovating. So the alternative to keeping efficiency out is and this is why the spectral efficiency and economic results are related, because you lose the economic benefit if you're not spectrally efficient.
Thank you. Well, I think we'd like to open up the panel for questions from the audience, and hopefully a student with the first question. And
how do we know who's a student?
Raise two hands if you're a student.
Right.
Okay. We'll go with you, and then the gentleman next.
Thank you. So my question is about how we're measuring success. I noticed a lot of arguments about broad economic success and then specifically to industry or company players, which seems to be at odds with the sort of founding priorities of the FCC. You're supposed to serve the public, and the airwaves, in fact, are owned in trust by the public. So I'm curious about how you're measuring success in broad economic terms or specific industry terms and not in terms of benefit to the public.
I'm going to just start out on a little bit of a history lesson, which is implicit, I think, in some of the things here. Is one of the reasons that lotteries were adopted was because the FCC tried to apply what was really a broadcast standard to cellular. And if I remember correctly, and there's got to be somebody here who can correct me if I'm wrong, that the LA license was granted on the basis of like one cell site that actually covered a particular area. And so what happened is Congress went, we need to do something, this is ridiculous. So I think part of what you're asking is a really good question, but ultimately, it's also about serving customers. And so getting the spectrum out there quickly to serve consumers, and I said customers, but it's really, the American public consumers, getting as much innovation as you can possibly get there. I don't think that's really at odds with what, the fundamental purpose of the Act is. And I think the Commission has done, in fact, a fabulous job at meeting the purposes, and has recognized when the way that they used to do things just doesn't work anymore. And lotteries, can I just say this? It's funny, that's one of the things that is on here that I think a lot of people would probably think of being not a success. And Jennifer and I were talking about this earlier. In fact, what lotteries did is it showed the economic value of these licenses in stark terms, which is what ultimately led Congress, with big support from OMB and the administration at the time, to finally adopt auction authority.
Could you just, for some people in the audience, just back off and just explain the lottery? What was the lottery about, and what did it replace?
Yeah, basically, it's kind of exactly what you might think it is. It was what you could actually, for very little money, I think it was around $5,000. There were application mills that would put together an application for you, that the Commission would set up a window and say, you can actually apply during this time frame. So you'd have people who would join in and just sort of, put their name on and, given a couple $100 or something, sometimes more, sometimes less. They would then, the Commission would hold a lottery, and they'd have these ping pong balls. And it would come out, and you would actually, based on the number that came out of this air-popping ping pong ball, that's how they picked the winners of the particular application. So that you'd have cases. In one case, I think, and this was when I was at NTIA, so we were doing a lot of research on this, but the Cape Cod market sold for literally like within months for, I think it was around $70 million, which would be dwarfed by today's standards, but it still was an amazing amount of money for somebody that had, maybe put in a couple of $100s to get a license. So, I mean, you could go and you could actually watch it. This is a little bit before my time, because by the time I started, lotteries were still going on, but most of the cellular markets had been, the top 30 markets were done by beauty contest. And then the rest of the markets, what at the time, they weren't all RSAs, but they were called rural service areas. They were, not all of them, because the wireline carrier would get a freebie, and then the other side, the A side license, was then lottery. So I don't know, with somebody else around who could give a better explanation. But
Oh, I think you did it great. I know that the winners of those lotteries define those as successes, though.
well, actually, I do, because what it was a progression where the public policymakers recognized there was a problem with doing it this way. Let's try another way. Oh, wait, there's a problem with doing it this way. Why don't we try another way? And that other way has been used now for, over 20 years. And I think that other way, while it has issues too, also gets spectrum out a little bit quicker because you've got this whole tension about getting money into the Treasury.
So can I go back to the question, because I think there's sort of inherent in that maybe an assumption that an economic measure is the same as an industry measure. And I don't know if you're saying that, but I don't think that's necessarily true. So, what the statute says is the public interest. And that, of course, has been a remarkably squishy, largely undefined concept. What I was saying was that the way I would measure the public interest is, did consumers get good stuff? And I would measure that, I don't know how else to measure it other than, did it create jobs? Did they get consumer surplus? Did they get innovations? Did it improve the standard of life? Did people live longer? Whatever the measures are, I think of those as economic measures, but I don't think of those as industry measures. I don't think of those as, did businesses make more money or did shareholders make more money? Now, there is the alternative, and maybe David was about to talk about the alternative, which is to talk about much more high-level forms of measurement, like, did this decision improve the state of democracy in the country? Did it lead to better educational outcomes? Did it just sort of strike us as a more inherently fair or just way of making the particular decision? I'm not saying, and that has been the basis of a lot of the debate about what is the public interest. And I'm not saying that that latter approach is wrong. I just don't know how to measure those things. And maybe that's just a failing of my education.
And all I was going to say is I think that some of it is, I think this happens a lot. I don't think we communicated well in that I think everything we're talking about is how to get to customers, is how to get to consumers and get the best possible service to consumers. The problem is that if you start defining it by consumer, is that now you actually are prescribing. There's a lot of really cool things done with Spectrum. There's a lot of really interesting products that are out there. There's a lot of interesting services. Again, I mean, we launch satellites all the time that are doing just, this is what I do now. It's that are doing all kinds of, it's Earth observation where we're now better at predicting the weather than we ever were before because we can do these Earth, that's using Spectrum in different ways. And so if you get too specific on how you're serving customers in this particular way, you actually are locking in certain kinds of technology. And I think when we're talking about flexibility, while we are focused, when we talk about it as an industry level, I think what we are thinking about is when you're trying to maximize the economic result, what you're trying to get is the most good uses to consumers. And I think that's what Larry and Rob are talking about is when we're saying maximize their economic output, it's how are consumers best served? And that may not always be with a particular wireless phone. It could be in a lot of different ways. And so I think sometimes we don't communicate that well, that's what we're trying to get at. But I think that is what we're all trying to get at, is how are we serving customers in the best way.
Before we come to you, good question. Yeah.
Hi, Vince DiMichele, CU Law student. So my question is more along the time dimension. So we know the technology outpaces the policy, and as the curve gets steeper, just do you see any truly superfluous corners to cut in the way of policy so that we can get the right regulation out at the right time?
Well, yeah, so one right off the bat, which we talk about all the time, is just improving the robustness of the secondary markets. I mean, this is really the flip side of flexibility, is we give you a license, we want to make it as easy as possible for you to get rid of that license if it turns out your technology didn't work out, or it's outlived its usefulness, or now you can move to a different technology and now you don't need that anymore. So certainly, anything that we can do to make the secondary markets more liquid would be great. And of course, part of that has to do with how the license is defined in the first place, how it defines what it is you're being licensed to do, and making that as broad as possible, but then also giving you the opportunity to dispose of it on a secondary market if at any point somebody wants to offer you more for it than you think it's worth. That's sort of the basis of a contract.
We'll go to you and then you.
So I'd like to ask a simple question to all four members of the panel.
Or no, like
Yeah,
Congress?
kind of like that. So if you have a choice between getting rid of Wi-Fi or getting rid of 3GPP, which one do you get rid of?
I'm not answering that one.
Why is that a choice, I guess would be my question back.
That's my question. You don't get to question my question. Answer it or pass.
Sure I do. I'm sitting
No,
up
I
here,
mean,
so I get to do...
It's a way of evaluating which has the most value. Which has the most value? If you had to get rid of one of them,
I think by getting rid of one of them, you would eliminate some value substantially.
so he didn't want to answer. Does anybody want to answer?
It's totally beyond my pay grade to answer. I
Yeah?
just don't know, honestly, Richard. I haven't sliced the idea.
I'm not going to answer that.
Nice try.
We have a question over here.
Al Gashevsky, I'm a professor of electrical engineering here. Al Gashevsky, I'm a professor of electrical engineering here. So a question primarily directed to David Goldman. The small satellite industry right now is burgeoning, you might even say exploding. And my question
Don't
to you
say that,
is...
actually. No, not the same.
Most of yours aren't, which is really good, because we want to use yours too. We want to use yours to get up there. But my question is the bandwidth necessary for this industry being identified and allocated rapidly enough, you think, right now, in order for the U.S. to maintain a lead in this burgeoning, not exploding, business?
That is a great question. I think it's one of the things that as we move higher and higher up the spectrum chart, it's becoming there's like a gold rush of constantly trying to move up higher and higher and to see who wants it. Somehow everything that, when the satellite guys start looking at it and say, this looks like good spectrum, 5G shows up and somehow needs it more. Anyway, but no, I think that's a great question. I think it is really true, and I think that's something that the FCC really needs to work on. Is we do have a burgeoning satellite market. It is evolving. We're seeing a lot of kind of next generation communications going on there, and I do think the FCC does need to balance of making sure the opportunities are available for all the technologies to try it out. Let's let the. I mean, I take Charla's point, but the measure here shouldn't be how much money you're getting into the Treasury. The measure should be how is it best serving the public, and we should be allowing the market to decide which is the better technology, what they want, where it works in different places. I think there's benefits to each, and so I do think that it's worth it for the FCC to look at and make sure as we're moving into new spectrum bands that we're not foreclosing one use or the other. We're not preferring one use over the other. Let's let this all develop and see. Let's not make decisions prematurely on that. But I think that is something that I think that is a great question. I think it's something that the FCC needs to be grappling with.
We actually think that one of the best ways to deal with technical neutrality is to actually, if you pay for your spectrum, you can buy it. I know Jennifer would love that one.
So now we're going to scrap all the success stuff we talked about and said money for the Treasury is the highest and best use.
It's highest and best use. It's there's auction theory in here somewhere, right, Tom? You knew I had to say that.
Oh, one more question, and then we're going to have to wrap up.
think there's an element of discussion that hasn't been covered yet. There are a lot of people that, for one reason or another, are out of the general consumer economy. There are people who are flat out poor. In fact, a lot of them. The homeward gap is really a manifestation of economic privation. And there are people who live in rural areas who may have money, but they can't really pay what it costs to serve them. So when the Communications Act says all the people of the United States, it includes people like that. And so the whole Coasian idea that, you know, market mechanisms and flexibility is going to solve everything, I think really leaves a lot of stuff out. And there actually are mechanisms. You know, there's the E-rate, which is outside the market, and there's rural subsidies for telecommunications, which is outside the market. And there are some spectrum allocations that are outside the market. And those are important things to do too. Nobody's talked about any of that yet today.
I don't know that I heard a question. Does anyone have a comment? All right, well, thanks to all of you for your...
So thank you very much to the panel. We have another break. We'll be starting